The bouncy hum of a bustling diner filled the air as people shuffled between tables, their faces flushed with warmth against the chill outside. It wasn't the kind of place one expected to see Barron Trump, composed, and every bit the reserved young man he had become known to be. Yet, here he was, seated in a corner booth, unassumingly sipping a cup of tea. For a brief moment, he was just another face in the crowd, far removed from the shadow of his famous last name. Behind the counter, an elderly waitress named Eileen hurried through her shift, her trembling hands balancing trays laden with steaming plates. Her uniform, worn and frayed, bore the stains of years spent serving strangers with a smile. Even as the weight of life pressed heavily on her shoulders, tonight was no different. Bills were piling up, her aching joints protested every step, but she pushed on because she had to. As Eileen approached Barron's table with a fresh pot of coffee, her foot caught the edge of a misplaced chair. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the pot tipped from her hands, sending scalding liquid cascading toward Barron. Gasps erupted across the diner. For a split second, everyone held their breath, waiting for the inevitable storm of anger or outrage from the young man. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he rose to his feet with an unexpected calmness, his sharp blue eyes meeting Eileen's tear-filled gaze. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady and warm, even as the hot liquid seeped into his designer shirt. "Are you hurt?" Eileen frowned, her face a canvas of fear and embarrassment. The room was silent, all eyes locked on the two figures at the center of the commotion. What came next would leave everyone stunned. Eileen's face crumpled as she struggled to form words, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't mean," Barron gently interrupted, his hand raised in reassurance. "Don't worry about it," he said, his tone kind but firm. "It was an accident. These things happen." The tension in the room began to ease, but Eileen's hands shook as she tried to wipe the spilled coffee from the table. Barron noticed and stepped aside, motioning for her to take a breath. "Please, let me help," he said, reaching for a napkin. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he wasn't the least bit concerned about the now ruined shirt he wore. The other diners exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. It wasn't every day they saw someone like Barron Trump, son of a billionaire, a figure often shrouded in controversy, cleaning up after a mess that wasn't his fault. Eileen finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "You're too kind," she said, her eyes welling up. "I've seen people lash out over less. I'll pay for the shirt, I promise." Barron shook his head, offering her a small, disarming smile. "It's just a shirt," he said simply. "You don't need to worry about that. But are you okay? Did you get burned?" His words struck a chord, not just with Eileen, but with everyone watching. Here was someone who could have easily demanded compensation or made a scene, yet his first instinct was to show concern for a woman who'd spent her life being overlooked. Eileen nodded, though her voice broke. "I'm fine, really, thank you." Barron reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp bill and pressing it into her trembling hand. "Take this," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Consider it a tip for everything you've done tonight. And please, take care of yourself." Eileen's lips parted in surprise, her grip tightening on the bill. It was far more than she could have expected, a gesture that, for her, was more than just money. It was dignity, kindness, and humanity wrapped in one. The diner was quiet again, but this time it wasn't out of shock. It was out of respect. Eileen watched as Barron calmly returned to his seat, brushing off the entire incident as though it hadn't happened. Her heart felt heavy with gratitude, but also something deeper, a renewed sense of worth that she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, she hesitated, clutching the bill in her hand. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he had treated her, like a person who mattered, despite her mistake. Across the diner, whispers grew louder. A family in a nearby booth leaned in, their curiosity evident. A middle-aged man at the counter muttered something about how kids these days could learn a thing or two from him. Even the manager, a gruff man named Harold, who rarely ventured out of the kitchen, peeked his head around the corner, watching the scene unfold with an expression that could only be described as disbelief. Barron, however, paid no mind to the growing attention. He quietly asked the waitress at the next table for a glass of water, his shirt still damp from the spill. It was then that Eileen found the courage to step forward again, this time with a tray holding a fresh cup of coffee and a plate of pie. "For you," she said softly, placing them in front of him. Barron looked up. "Puzzled. You don't have to do that," he said. Eileen smiled for the first time that evening, the lines on her face softening. "I insist. It's the least I can do." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "It's been a long time since someone showed me this kind of kindness. Most people, they don't even see me anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Barron seemed to hesitate. His calm demeanor gave way to a flicker of something deeper, moment of connection. "You deserve to be seen," he said finally, his voice low but earnest. "You deserve so much more." The room grew quieter still, and the weight of his words lingered. For Eileen, they were more than just a kind sentiment. They were a balm for years of invisible struggles. And for everyone else, it was a stark reminder of how little it took to make someone feel valued. As Barron took a bite of the pie, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "This is great," he said, breaking the tension with a light-hearted comment. The room relaxed, laughter rippling softly through the crowd. And just like that, what had begun as an accident became a moment none of them would forget. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The once tense air was now filled with a sense of camaraderie, as if the entire room had shared in something unspoken. Eileen continued to move between tables, but now there was a lightness in her step, a new spark in her eyes that had been missing for years. Barron remained seated in his booth, quietly observing the world around him, though he seemed less distant than before. A few moments later, a group of teenagers walked in, their chatter loud and carefree. They had noticed Barron the moment they entered, but unlike most people, they didn't stare or whisper. One of them, a girl with dark curly hair, approached Barron with a hesitant smile. "Are you Barron Trump?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity, though not the usual all that others often displayed when meeting someone famous. Barron nodded, his expression friendly but not imposing. "I am." The girl hesitated for a moment before continuing. You're different from what I expected." Barron raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How so?" She shrugged, looking around at the bustling diner. "You're not like the stuff I see in the news. You don't seem all stiff and distant. You're just here, eating pie like the rest of us." Barron chuckled. The sound surprisingly genuine. "I like pie," he said simply, "and I like peace and quiet." The girl smiled, her initial nervousness fading. "Well, I think that's cool. I've gotta admit, I thought you'd be more like the pictures, but you seem like a regular guy. It's kinda nice." Barron leaned back, crossing his arms as he surveyed the group. "I think people forget that we're all just people. Everyone has their story, their struggles. It's easy to put people on pedestals and forget they're just trying to get by, like everyone else." The girl's eyes softened, and for a moment, the din of the diner seemed to fade as she took in his words. "That's deep. I think I get it now. You're not what I thought, but in a good way." Barron gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Glad to hear it." As the teenagers returned to their table, the diner continued to buzz with its usual energy, but for a brief moment, the space had felt different, less like a busy diner and more like a place where people truly saw each other, where even the smallest gestures of kindness could ripple outward, affecting those around them in ways they hadn't expected. As the night grew late and the crowd began to thin out, Barron sat quietly, finishing his pie and sipping his water. The diner was quieter now, just a few patrons lingering over their meals. Eileen, having made her rounds, approached his table once more, her hands once again trembling, but this time with a different energy. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet warmth. Barron looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze with a small but genuine smile. "No, I'm good," he replied, "but I just wanted to thank you. You've been a great host tonight." Eileen blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. "You've been too kind," she said, shaking her head. "No one's ever thanked me like that before. It's always just get the food, get the drink, and move on." Barron leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Everyone deserves to feel appreciated," he said softly, "especially people who work hard and go unnoticed." Eileen's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. She hadn't expected this encounter to mean so much to her, but here she was, standing before a young man who, despite his wealth and status, had made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. "You're a good person, Barron," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You remind me of something I'd almost forgotten, how to see the good in others, even when it feels like the world's forgotten me." Barron Saturday back, allowing her words to sink in. There was a fleeting moment of discomfort, a reminder of the world he came from, where everything was often measured by status, wealth, and power, but in this small diner, there were no such distinctions. It was a place where people could still see one another, not for what they had, but for who they were. As Eileen turned to walk away, Barron called out to her softly, "If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. I mean it." The look she gave him was one of disbelief, but also of hope, as though someone had just opened a door she'd long forgotten existed. "Thank you, Barron. You've made this night one I won't forget." As Eileen walked back to the kitchen, Barron sat her quietly, reflecting on the events of the evening. The diner, with its clattering dishes and low hum of conversation, had transformed into a place of unexpected connection, a place where people, despite their differences, had been able to see each other as equals, even if just for a fleeting moment. He hadn't expected this when he walked in. He hadn't expected a simple coffee spill to change the course of his night, to pull him out of his usual, guarded self. But that's exactly what had happened. Eileen had been more than just a waitress. She had been a mirror, showing him the forgotten corners of empathy and understanding that he needed to rediscover. Outside, the cold night air greeted him as he stepped out of the diner, the weight of the moment still lingering in his chest. Barron had always been aware of the world's harshest expectations placed upon him, the weight of his last name, the constant scrutiny, but tonight had been different. Tonight had reminded him that real change began not with grand gestures, but with small acts of kindness, the kind that didn't ask for recognition or applause. As he walked down the quiet street, he felt a flicker of hope for the future. Perhaps, in some small way, he could be a part of the change that this world so desperately needed. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Redemption was never an easy path. But as he thought back to Eileen's smile, to the teenager's words, and to the warmth that had spread through the diner, Barron understood something fundamental. Kindness, even in its simplest form, was never wasted. And as for Eileen, he knew she would carry this night with her long after he had left. A reminder that even in a world filled with shadows, there were still those who chose to shine their light on others. Barron stopped in his tracks for a moment, looking up at the stars above, and whispered quietly to himself, "There's always room for kindness." The next morning, Barron woke up with a quiet sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The chaotic world outside felt a little smaller, a little less overwhelming. He had always been accustomed to a life that demanded his attention, that constantly pulled him in 1,000 directions. But last night had been different. There was something humbling in the simplicity of that diner, the way people interacted with each other without judgment, without the weight of expectations. Barron couldn't stop thinking about Eileen. Her strength, her kindness, even in the face of struggle, had left a lasting impression on him. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a reflection of so many people who worked tirelessly, unnoticed, their efforts going unseen by most. And yet, it was those very people who made the world turn, whose kindness went unnoticed until a moment like last night gave them a chance to shine. As he sat by the window, looking out at the city's morning bustle, Barron's thoughts shifted to his own place in the world. He had always felt like an outsider, no matter how much his family tried to include him in their world. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could carve out his own space, a space where kindness and connection mattered more than status or wealth. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. People would continue to view him through the lens of his last name, through the lens of power. But Barron was starting to understand that true power came not from money or fame, but from the ability to connect with others on a deeper level. Later that day, Barron made a decision. He returned to the diner, feeling a sense of resolve that had been missing from his life for years. The moment he walked through the door, Eileen saw him immediately, her face lighting up in recognition. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, but something in Barron's eyes told her that he wasn't just passing through. "Hello, Eileen," Barron said, his voice calm, but with a new kind of warmth to it. "Mr. Trump," she said, almost in surprise, but her smile was genuine. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon." "I wanted to thank you again," Barron said, taking a seat at the counter, "and I also wanted to make sure you're doing okay." Eileen gave a soft laugh, the kind that only comes when someone truly appreciates another person. "I'm doing just fine, thank you. You've already done more than enough for me." Barron smiled, but his gaze was steady. "I mean it," he said. "I want to help, really help. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think there's something I can do." Eileen's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Barron paused for a moment, then spoke with newfound certainty. "There's a foundation I work with. They help people in situations like yours. I'd like to connect you with them. No strings attached, just to make sure you have the support you deserve." Eileen's eyes widened in shock. "You don't have to do that, Barron." But Barron's smile was unwavering. "I want to. People like you deserve a chance to breathe, to not have to fight every day just to get by. If I can help in some small way, I will." For the first time in a long while, Eileen's face was alight with hope. She had never expected this moment, never imagined someone like Barron Trump, with all his privilege, would care enough to reach out. But there was a genuine offer of help, not born from obligation, but from empathy. As Barron stood to leave, Eileen called out to him, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Barron. You've given me more than just help. You've given me hope." Barron nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "It's the least I can do," he said simply. As he walked out of the diner, the cold air seemed warmer, the city seemed brighter. Barron didn't have all the answers, and he knew that change wouldn't come overnight. But in that moment, he understood something essential. Real power wasn't about what you could take from the world, it was about what you could give. And for the first time in a long time, Barron felt that he was finally heading in the right direction. Please comment and subscribe to the channel if you want more magical stories like this.